Hi, everybody. So, today we're going to be looking at sources of finance, where businesses actually get their money from. You'll notice there's quite a few different places that they actually get their money from, and we'll have a look at each of them and how businesses use those different sources. Obviously, if we're going to start a business, we'll need some money to come from somewhere. Most of the time, businesses are going to try and get money from an external source. Of course, the other way that they can put money into their business is their own money. We'd call that an internal source. So, if the business owner puts their own money into their business, they are actually contributing money that they haven't borrowed from anyone else, have actually saved it up, or it's their own. Obviously, for many businesses, they'll need to go external to try and find people to borrow money from. And as we'll see, there's advantages and disadvantages associated with each. So if the owner's not putting their own funds in, they're going to have to try and get funds from outside. And as we'll see, there's a number of different forms of funding that can happen for a business. They can be either external or internal. So if we're talking about the owner's own money, it's their personal funds, it's internal to the business, it's not actually going outside. We're going to spend some time talking about external funds in this class as well. So we talk about equity, which is the funds contributed by the business owners to start and then expand the business. So if they start with their own money, they've put their own money into the business, they've saved up, and they haven't actually borrowed anything. This is referred to as equity. The great advantage of this is because it doesn't have to actually be repaid because the owner has put it in themselves, and it's obviously cheaper than any other source of finance because they're not paying any interest on that particular money. And obviously, if equity is being used to finance the business, or in other words, the owner's own money, they have total control over how that money would be used. Now, one of the disadvantages, however, is that the owner might expect a good return on their investment, but the amount of money or finance that they've actually got might not be able to generate enormous profits and good returns. The other way that we can raise money is by taking on a partner or seeking funds from another investor. And we can also try and sell off any unproductive asset, whatever our business might be, and try and liquidate that and use that money in the business as well. So when it comes to external sources of finance, it's always going to be normally in the form of debt. And obviously the problem with debt is you have to pay it back, and you have to pay it back with interest. So there is a bit of a two sides to this. The good thing is it'll allow us to access a lot more money. The downside is obviously that we are going to have to repay that money plus interest. And that's going to mean that the business will need to be producing an income to enable us to actually borrow money and know we can pay it back. So one form of borrowing is short-term borrowing, and this type of borrowing is when we are only needing money for a short period of time. And when we talk about short-term, normally saying within about 1 or 2 years, where we borrow the money and have it repaid. One of the most common forms of short-term borrowing is a bank overdraft. And essentially what this is, the bank actually allows businesses to overdraw their account, in other words, to spend money that they don't actually have. They don't mind that because normally the customer is a good one. They know they'll repay that. And a bank overdraft is generally one of the more common ways that businesses will borrow on a short term for a short term reason. Some businesses will actually use what is known as trade credit. And this is where if they're buying products from a certain supplier, the supplier might actually provide those products to the business on a term where they don't have to repay it for some time. And as a result of that, the business can actually use those goods or services without actually having to pay for them as soon as they've got them. Obviously, there's different rules and regulations regarding trade credit, but you can imagine if a plumber, for example, had a good relationship with a hardware store, they might be able to get some of their supplies at a very cheap rate, or be able to maybe borrow or have access to them without actually paying them off in full until a little bit later. Long-term borrowing, as the name suggests, is where the loan is going to be repaid over a much longer period of time. Normally going to be done if we're buying something that is relatively expensive, such as real estate or new equipment, new plant, and that kind of thing. Mortgage is also known as a home loan. It's normally secured by the property that we're actually purchasing. So in this case, it would be a house. But if we're buying a new factory, for example, we might have a mortgage on that. There would be regular repayments, normally over 15, 20, 25 years. Some of you might be aware at the moment, interest rates on home loans or mortgages historically never really been lower. Most people would probably have a loan around just under 4%, which is incredibly good. I mean, the late 1980s interest rates were over 18%, so much cheaper at the moment to borrow money. Another form of borrowing is leasing. This is where businesses will actually have access to equipment but not actually own them. A good example would be something like a photocopier. The school might, for example, lease a photocopier. They make regular repayments on that photocopier, but they never actually own it. So if anything goes wrong with it, it's relatively easy to get someone to come out and fix it because it's not actually the business's itself. But it saves the business thousands of dollars in actually purchasing that kind of equipment, which, as you'd probably have worked out, is going to get out of date very quickly, could break down. So it's actually a good idea to lease that kind of thing. And a lot of businesses will lease things like motor vehicles as well. So one of the advantages of leasing is, firstly, you can actually use the product, but you don't actually have to worry about paying for it in full. There are some really good tax deductions available for leasing certain pieces of equipment or vehicles. There are some disadvantages, of course, one of which is that there are charges or high interest charges on leasing, and you obviously have to be bringing in regular amounts of cash to make the repayments for the lease. It's also worth remembering that government grants are available. The government will actually give small businesses in particular a fair bit of financial support. There are different grants that businesses can apply for, and as a result, be able to access some funds to help them with whatever plans might be, particularly if they were wanting to export products. Well, obviously the terms of finance are going to need to suit the purpose for which the funds are borrowed. So if it's only short term, then short term financing would be fine. And also we'd need to make sure that our long term finance is not going to be such that we wouldn't be able to repay that over a lengthy period of time. So we've got to sort of think about the future and how our business might be positioned. Obviously, the structure of the business can also influence our choice of finance. If we're a large business with shareholders, we might be able to raise funds a little bit more easily than if we're a small business. The overall cost of each alternative source of finance is clearly a very important factor. And so most businesses are going to be very careful about what type of loan and borrowing they'll get into. Most of the time, of course, with an eye to making sure they can repay that. So one of the things that we're probably trying to do is have flexibility in terms of our borrowing. So if times are going well, we can make more repayments and try and bring that loan down. Likewise, in hard times, we might be able to be flexible and reduce our repayments. And you're actually seeing that at the moment with a number of businesses having banks and other lenders showing them a fair bit of leniency given the situation with most businesses having slowed down due to the virus and the shutdown. And most businesses now, and particularly with the banking situation, the banks are quite aware of the fact that businesses are in very difficult times, and as a result are being quite helpful in today's situation. I guess one of the main things is businesses would always like to make decisions whereby they have as much control as possible over their business themselves. So if they borrow money and get into an incredible amount of debt, that will make it difficult for them to run the business as they would have liked. they actually tend to lose control, because what actually happens is the business is constantly repaying debt and not actually looking at ways of growing the business and putting those funds where it should actually be. So what we'd like you to do today in class is to look at two tables. We want you to actually prepare tables about the advantages and disadvantages of using equity to finance a business, and then the advantages and disadvantages of using debt. So obviously remembering equity is the owner's own funds that are going into the business, or internal financing, and debt is where we're actually borrowing money from other individuals or businesses and using that to finance our business. Okay, so if you guys have a go at that, that'd be terrific. And as I said, all the notes and slides are here, so feel free to go back and check them if you need to.